I was arranging flowers in my favorite crystal vase Thursday morning when I heard my daughter-in-law Jessica's voice drifting through the open kitchen window from next door. At 71, I'd learned that sometimes the most important conversations happen when people think you're not listening. Jessica was talking to someone on the phone in her backyard, and her voice carried that particular tone she used when she was sharing gossip she thought was especially juicy. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. Poor Helen, Jessica was saying, and I paused with a white chrysanthemum halfway to the vase. Michael says she's gotten so much worse lately. Yesterday she couldn't remember what day it was, and last week she left the stove on for hours. We're really worried about her living alone. I set the flower down carefully and moved closer to the window. Michael was my son, and Helen was me. The doctor says it's definitely early-stage dementia. Jessica continued. Michael's been trying to get her to move to assisted living, but you know how stubborn these older folks can be. The crystal vase felt suddenly heavy in my hands. I set it on the counter and walked slowly to my kitchen table, where yesterday's newspaper lay folded beside my reading glasses. I could see the date clearly printed at the top, Thursday, September 14th. I knew exactly what day it was, just as I'd known every day for the past 71 years. As for the stove, I'd made myself scrambled eggs that very morning and turned everything off properly, the same way I'd done every morning since I learned to cook at my mother's side 60 years ago. I picked up my phone and scrolled to Michael's contact information. When had I last spoken to my son? 2 weeks ago, when he'd called to check on me after a minor fender bender in the grocery store parking lot. I'd mentioned feeling a little scattered that day, overwhelmed by the insurance paperwork and the other driver's hostile attitude. Michael had been so understanding, so concerned. He'd offered to come over and help with the forms, but I'd managed them myself just fine once I'd had a cup of tea and settled my nerves. My hands weren't shaking as I set the phone back down, which surprised me. Inside, though, something had shifted, like when you think you're stepping onto solid ground and find quicksand instead. Through the window, Jessica had moved on to discussing someone else's family drama, but her earlier words kept echoing in my mind. Early-stage dementia. Doctor's report. Assisted living. I walked through my house slowly, looking at everything with new eyes. The bills I'd paid and filed neatly in my desk organizer. The grocery list I'd written in my precise handwriting, organized by store sections to make shopping more efficient. The book I'd been reading, marked with a bookmark at page 237, because I always remembered exactly where I'd stopped. The crossword puzzle from Sunday's paper, completed in ink, because I'd been doing them long enough to trust my answers. Everything in my home spoke to a mind that was functioning perfectly well, thank you very much. So why was my son telling people otherwise? The phone rang just after noon, startling me from my thoughts. Michael's name appeared on the caller ID, and for a moment I considered not answering. But curiosity won out over hurt feelings. "Hi, Mom." His voice was warm, familiar, tinged with what I now recognized as carefully practiced concern. "How are you feeling today?" The question struck me as odd. Michael had never asked about my feelings in quite that way before. Usually he'd ask what I was doing or if I needed anything from the store. "I'm feeling fine, sweetheart," I said, keeping my voice light. "Just finished arranging some flowers from the garden. The chrysanthemums are beautiful this year." There was a pause, longer than seemed natural. "That's great, Mom. Listen, I was wondering if you'd like to have dinner this weekend. Maybe Saturday night? Jessica's making that pot roast you like." Dinner at their house had become a weekly tradition over the past few months, I realized. When had that started? And why? I had always been perfectly capable of cooking for myself, had actually enjoyed the quiet ritual of preparing meals in my own kitchen. "That sounds lovely," I said. "Should I bring anything?" Another pause. No, don't worry about it, just bring yourself. We'll take care of everything." After he hung up, I stood in my kitchen holding the phone and thinking about the way he'd said those last words. "We'll take care of everything." Not "we'll handle dinner," or "don't trouble yourself." Take care of everything, as if I were incapable of contributing anything meaningful to a simple family meal. I spent the afternoon in my garden, weeding the flower beds and deadheading the roses. Physical work had always helped me think more clearly, and I had a lot to think about. The sun was warm on my shoulders, and my hands moved efficiently through familiar tasks. This was not the behavior of someone with dementia, I thought. This was the behavior of someone who'd been maintaining a garden for 43 years, and could do it with her eyes closed. When Mrs. Patterson from across the street waved from her front porch, I walked over to chat. Eleanor Patterson was 84, and sharp as a tack, a retired English professor who still corrected grammar in casual conversation. "Helen, dear," she said as I approached, "your garden looks magnificent this year. I was just telling my daughter how much I admire your organizational skills." She gestured toward my flower beds, which were indeed precisely planned and immaculately maintained. "I can never keep track of when to plant what, but you've got it down to a science." We chatted for 20 minutes about gardening techniques, local politics, and the new family that had moved in down the street. Eleanor's sharp questions and quick observations reminded me that there was nothing wrong with my conversational abilities either. I could follow complex discussions, remember details from previous conversations, and engage with new ideas just fine. Walking back to my house, I caught sight of Jessica peering at me through her kitchen window. When our eyes met, she quickly looked away, but not before I saw something that looked suspiciously like pity on her face. Or maybe guilt. That evening, I sat down with a notepad and began writing down everything I could remember about the past few months. Not because I was worried about my memory, but because I wanted to document it. If someone was spreading rumors about my mental capacity, I was going to arm myself with facts. The fender bender in August. I'd been distracted by a phone call from a telemarketer, not confused about where I was or how to drive. The insurance had been handled promptly and professionally. The other driver had actually complimented my calm handling of the situation. The incident with the stove that Jessica had mentioned, I racked my brain and finally remembered. 3 weeks ago, I'd started making soup and then gotten absorbed in a phone conversation with my sister in Florida. The conversation had gone on longer than expected, and when I'd returned to the kitchen, the soup was slightly overcooked but hardly a dangerous situation. I'd turned everything off, opened a window to clear the minor smoke, and made myself a sandwich instead, hardly the behavior of someone losing their faculties. The more I thought about it, the more I realized that Michael had been present or nearby for most of these minor incidents. The parking lot mishap he'd heard about within hours, even though I hadn't called him immediately. The overcooked soup he'd mentioned casually the next day, asking if everything was all right with my cooking. At the time, I'd thought he was just being an attentive son. Now I wondered if he'd been building a case. But why? What possible reason could Michael have for wanting people to think I was developing dementia? Friday morning brought partial answers in the form of overheard phone.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time. So if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story.
Conversation number 2. This time, Michael was in his backyard, and he clearly thought I was out running errands. His voice carried through my open bedroom window as I was making my bed. "The house has got to be worth at least $400,000 in this market," he was saying. "Maybe more, with that big lot and the updates Dad did before he passed." My hands stilled on the bedsheets. He was talking about my house. Our house, where I'd lived with his father for 38 years before Robert died, and where I'd continued to live quite happily for the past 5 years. "I know it seems fast," Michael continued, "but waiting isn't going to make this any easier. The longer she stays here alone, the more dangerous it becomes. What if she falls? What if she forgets to turn off the gas? What if she wanders off and gets lost?" I sank onto the edge of my bed, listening to my son describe a version of me that bore no resemblance to reality. I'd never wandered anywhere in my life except purposefully, had never forgotten to turn off appliances except for that one minor soup incident, and was steadier on my feet than women 20 years younger. "The assisted living place I looked at is really nice," Michael went on. "She'd have her own apartment, but there'd be people checking on her, meals provided, activities. She'd probably be happier there, around people her own age." The conversation continued, but I'd heard enough. My son was planning to sell my house and move me to assisted living based on a fictional diagnosis of dementia, that he'd apparently shared with half the neighborhood. I spent that morning doing something I'd never imagined I'd need to do. I called my doctor's office and scheduled an appointment for a comprehensive cognitive evaluation. Dr. Patricia Hendricks had been my physician for 12 years, and she knew me well enough to recognize that this request was unusual. Helen, her receptionist, said when I explained what I wanted, "Dr. Hendricks can see you Monday morning. Can I ask if you're having specific concerns about memory or cognition?" I chose my words carefully. I'd like a thorough evaluation for my own peace of mind. I want to make sure everything is documented properly. It wasn't a lie, exactly. I did want documentation, just not for the reasons most people would assume. Saturday dinner at Michael and Jessica's house was an education in subtle manipulation. They'd rearranged their dining room to make it easier for me to navigate, though I'd never had trouble with their furniture before. Jessica spoke to me slightly more loudly than necessary and repeated important information twice, as if I might not retain it the first time. "Dinner is pot roast, Mom," Michael said as he helped me off with my coat. "You know, the kind with carrots and potatoes that you used to make for me when I was little." I'd made that same pot roast hundreds of times and had never forgotten the recipe or the fact that it was his favorite. The implication that I might need reminding stung more than I'd expected. During dinner, they asked me questions designed to test my memory and reasoning abilities, though they tried to make it sound like casual conversation. "Do you remember what you did yesterday, Mom?" Jessica asked. "I worry that you're not staying active enough." I described my day in detail: morning garden work, grocery shopping, lunch with my book club, afternoons spent organizing photos for my sister's upcoming visit. Every activity was purposeful, social, and mentally engaging. "That's wonderful," Michael said, but his tone suggested he thought I was either lying or confused about what I'd actually done. "I just want to make sure you're taking care of yourself properly, eating regular meals, taking your medications on time, that sort of thing." I looked at him across the table, this man I'd raised from a helpless infant, and felt a profound sadness. "Michael," I said quietly, "I've been taking care of myself for 71 years. I managed to raise you and your sister, maintain a household, work full-time, and care for your father through 5 years of illness. What exactly makes you think I've suddenly become incapable of basic self-care?" The question hung in the air like something sharp and uncomfortable. Jessica focused intently on her plate, while Michael shifted in his chair and gave me that practiced smile I was learning to recognize. "I don't think you're incapable, Mom. I just worry. Living alone at your age, sometimes things can change gradually, and you might not notice." His voice was gentle, reasonable, the tone you'd use with someone whose judgment you didn't quite trust. "What things?" I pressed. "What specific changes have you noticed in my behavior or abilities?" Another pause. Michael glanced at Jessica, who kept her eyes on her food. "Well," he said finally, "there was that incident with the stove a few weeks ago, and you seemed pretty shaken up after that minor accident in the parking lot. Sometimes you repeat stories or forget what day it is." None of this was true, and he knew it. I'd never repeated stories, and I'd certainly never forgotten what day it was. The parking lot incident had been handled competently by anyone's standards. "Michael," I said, setting down my fork and looking directly at him, "I think we need to clear something up. I have never forgotten what day it is. I have never left appliances on dangerously. I handled that parking lot situation exactly as any reasonable person would. So where are you getting the idea that I'm experiencing cognitive decline?" He looked uncomfortable for the first time all evening. "I guess I'm just being overly cautious. You know how much I care about you." But his eyes didn't quite meet mine when he said it. The rest of dinner passed in stilted conversation about safer topics. Weather, local news, plans for the upcoming holidays. Michael walked me to my car afterward, his hand hovering protectively near my elbow as if he expected me to stumble. "Drive carefully, Mom," he said as I settled into the driver's seat. "Maybe next time I should pick you up instead." Night driving can be tricky. I'd driven at night without incident for over 50 years, including the drive to their house that very evening. "I'll be fine," I said, starting the engine with steady hands. "See you soon." As I pulled out of their driveway, I caught sight of Michael and Jessica in my rear-view mirror, standing together on their front porch. They were talking, their body language intense and focused. Planning something, I thought. The question was what? Sunday morning, I did something I hadn't done in months. I called my daughter Linda in Seattle. Linda was 2 years older than Michael, and had always been the more straightforward of my two children. If Michael was spreading stories about my mental health, Linda would either know about it or be able to help me understand what was happening. She answered on the second ring, sounding pleased to hear from me. "Mom, how are things? I was just thinking about you yesterday." "I'm well, sweetheart." "Listen, I wanted to ask you something. Has Michael mentioned anything to you about my health lately?" There was a pause, longer than I'd expected. "He's mentioned being worried about you living alone," Linda said carefully. "He thinks maybe you might be better off in some kind of senior community where there are people around." I felt my chest tighten. Did he say why he thinks that? Another pause. "Mom, are you feeling okay?" "Michael said you've been having some memory issues, getting confused about things. He's really concerned." So the story had reached Seattle. My son had been busy. "Linda," I said, "I want you to listen to me very carefully. I am not having memory issues. I am not confused about anything. I remember our conversations. I remember what I did yesterday, and last week, and last month. I drive safely, cook safely, manage my finances, maintain my home, and engage in regular social activities. If Michael told you otherwise, he was lying." The silence on the other end lasted so long, I thought we might have been disconnected. "Mom," Linda said finally, her voice very gentle, "sometimes people don't realize when they're having problems. Maybe you should see a doctor, just to put everyone's mind at ease." Even my own daughter, 3,000 miles away, had been convinced that I was losing my mind. "I have an appointment Monday morning," I said, "for a complete cognitive evaluation. When the results come back showing that my mental faculties are perfectly intact, I think we're all going to need to have a very different conversation." After I hung up, I sat in my kitchen with my untouched coffee and tried to understand what was happening to my family. How had my son become someone who would lie about his own mother's health, and why? Monday morning, I drove myself to Dr. Hendricks' office, navigating familiar streets with the same competence I'd shown for decades. I arrived 10 minutes early, checked in with the receptionist, and completed the required paperwork with clear, legible handwriting and accurate information. Dr. Hendricks was a woman about my daughter's age, professional but warm, with the kind of direct manner I'd always appreciated. "Helen," she said as I settled into the chair across from her desk, "I was surprised to get your request for cognitive testing. You've never shown any signs of memory problems or confusion in our previous appointments. What's prompted this evaluation?" I'd prepared for this question. "Doctor, I'd like you to do the most thorough assessment possible and document the results carefully. I have reasons to believe that someone may be questioning my mental capacity, and I want clear medical evidence of my actual cognitive status." Her eyebrows rose slightly. "I see. Well, let's find out exactly where you stand, shall we?" The next 2 hours were exhausting but oddly satisfying. Dr. Hendricks put me through a battery of tests designed to evaluate memory, reasoning, language skills, spatial awareness, and executive function. I answered questions, solved problems, recalled lists of words, drew geometric figures, and performed mental calculations. Some tests were easier than others, but I felt confident throughout the process. My mind felt sharp, focused, fully engaged with every challenge she presented. When we finished, Dr. Hendricks reviewed my results while I waited. "Helen," she said finally, "your cognitive function is not just normal for your age, it's exceptional. Your memory, both short-term and long-term, is excellent. Your reasoning abilities are superior. Your attention and concentration are those of someone decades younger." She looked up from her papers. "Based on these results, I would say you're in the top 10% of people your age in terms of mental acuity." Relief flooded through me, followed immediately by anger. "Doctor, I'd like you to write all of that down in a formal report. Include the specific test scores and your professional assessment. Make it as detailed and official as possible." She nodded, her expression curious. "Of course. May I ask what you plan to do with this report? I smiled, feeling more like myself than I had in weeks. I'm going to use it to have a very enlightening conversation with my son. Tuesday afternoon, armed with my cognitive evaluation results in an official envelope, I called Michael. I'd like you to come over this evening, I said. There's something important we need to discuss. He must have heard something different in my voice because he agreed immediately, sounding almost eager. Of course, Mom. Is everything all right? Everything is about to be much clearer, I said. While I waited for him to arrive, I set the dining room table with my good china and prepared a pot of coffee. This conversation deserved proper setting, the kind of formal atmosphere that would make it memorable. Michael arrived at 7 o'clock sharp, bringing Jessica with him. I hadn't expected her, but perhaps it was better this way. They both needed to hear what I had to say. Sit down, please, I said, gesturing to the chairs across from where I had positioned myself. Coffee. They accepted the coffee, but seemed nervous, glancing at each other in a way that confirmed they'd been discussing me before they arrived. Mom, Michael began, you sounded different on the phone. Are you feeling all right? I smiled at him, the same warm smile I'd given him for 37 years, though it felt different now. Michael, I'm feeling better than I have in weeks. In fact, I'm feeling completely vindicated. I reached for the envelope beside my coffee cup. Last Monday, I had a comprehensive cognitive evaluation performed by Dr. Hendricks. I thought you'd be interested in the results. Michael's face went very still. Jessica set down her coffee cup with a small clink against the saucer. You see? I continued, opening the envelope and removing the official report. I kept hearing rumors that I was experiencing memory problems, confusion, possibly early-stage dementia. Naturally, I wanted to get to the bottom of these concerns. I put on my reading glasses and opened the report. Dr. Hendricks administered what she described as the most thorough cognitive assessment available. Memory tests, reasoning evaluations, language assessments, problem-solving exercises. Very comprehensive. I looked up at Michael, who had gone pale. The results, I am happy to report, show that my cognitive function is not just normal for my age. According to Dr. Hendricks, it's exceptional. The silence in my dining room was profound. Outside, a dog barked somewhere down the street, and I could hear the distant sound of traffic, normal evening sounds in a world that had suddenly shifted on its axis. That's wonderful, Mom, Michael said finally, but his voice sounded strained. I'm so glad you're healthy. I nodded pleasantly. Yes, it is wonderful. It means that all those stories about me forgetting what day it is, leaving appliances on, being confused and disoriented, were completely false. I leaned forward slightly. Which raises an interesting question. Where did those stories come from? Jessica was staring at her hands. Michael shifted in his chair, looking anywhere but directly at me. I continued conversationally. Someone has been telling people that I have dementia. Someone has been discussing my supposed need for assisted living. Someone has been describing incidents of confusion and memory loss that never actually happened. I took a sip of my coffee, letting the implications settle. Now, who could that someone be? Michael finally met my eyes, and for a moment I saw something there I'd never seen before. Not the confusion of a concerned son, but the calculation of someone whose plan had been discovered. Mom, he said carefully, maybe there have been some misunderstandings. I smiled again. Oh, I don't think there have been any misunderstandings at all. I think someone has been very deliberately spreading false information about my mental health. The question is why. The question hung between us like a blade. Through my dining room window, I could see the lights coming on in neighbors' houses as families settled in for quiet Tuesday evenings. All of them probably trusted their adult children to have their best interests at heart. I was learning that trust, like so many other things I'd taken for granted, was more fragile than I'd ever imagined. The silence stretched between us like a taut wire ready to snap. Michael's jaw worked as if he were chewing words he couldn't quite bring himself to say, while Jessica had become fascinated with the pattern on her coffee cup. I waited, Because after 7 decades of life, I'd learned that sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is simply allow uncomfortable truths to breathe in the space between people. Finally, Michael cleared his throat. "Mom, I think maybe we should talk about this privately." He glanced meaningfully at Jessica. "Family business, you know." I set my coffee cup down with deliberate precision. "Jessica is family, Michael. She's your wife, which makes her my daughter-in-law. More importantly, she's been part of spreading these stories about my mental health. I heard her on the phone just last week, telling someone about my supposed confusion and memory problems." Jessica's head snapped up, her cheeks flushing red. "Helen, I never meant—" "What did you never mean, Jessica?" I kept my voice level, curious rather than accusatory. "Never mean to discuss my private medical information with neighbors? Never mean to spread false stories about my competence? Or never mean to get caught doing it?" Quote. Michael reached across the table and put his hand over Jessica's, a protective gesture that might have seemed touching if I hadn't known better. "Mom, we're worried about you. Maybe the tests show you're fine now, but things can change. We just want to make sure you're safe." I opened the medical report again and found the section I'd marked with a yellow sticky note. According to Dr. Hendricks, people with my test scores typically maintain their cognitive abilities well into their 80s and beyond. She specifically noted that there are no indicators of current or impending dementia. I looked up at both of them. "So your concerns about my future mental decline seem premature by about 15 years. The clock on my mantel chimed 8 o'clock, and I realized we'd been sitting here for an hour. An hour of careful verbal dancing around the real issue, which none of us had been willing to name directly. Let me ask you something different," I said, closing the medical report and setting it aside. "Michael, when did you first start thinking about selling this house?" The question landed like a stone in still water, sending ripples of shock across both their faces. Michael's hand tightened on Jessica's, and she looked at him with something that might have been panic. "I don't know what you mean," Michael said, but his voice had gone higher, the way it used to when he was 12 and had broken something valuable. "Friday morning," I continued conversationally, "you were in your backyard discussing property values. $400,000, you said. Maybe more with the lot size and the improvements your father made." I picked up my coffee cup again, pleased to note that my hands were completely steady. "You also mentioned assisted living arrangements and how much happier I'd be around people my own age." Jessica made a small sound that might have been a whimper. Michael had gone very still, the way people do when they're calculating their next move. "You were listening to a private conversation," he said finally. "I was in my own bedroom, in my own house, with my own windows open," I replied. "If you wanted privacy, perhaps you should have gone inside." I took a sip of coffee and studied my son's face. "The real question is why you were having that conversation at all. Why would you be discussing selling my house and moving me to assisted living when, according to medical professionals, there's absolutely nothing wrong with me?" Michael stood up abruptly, beginning to pace around my dining room the way he used to when he was agitated as a teenager. "Maybe because I love you and I'm worried about your future. Is that so hard to believe?" "It would be easy to believe if it were true," I said. "But loving, worried sons don't usually fabricate stories about their mothers' mental health. They don't spread rumors in the neighborhood about dementia that doesn't exist. And they certainly don't discuss property sales behind their mothers' backs." Jessica finally spoke up, her voice barely above a whisper. "Helen, maybe we made some mistakes in how we handled this, but our intentions were good." I turned to look at her directly. "What mistakes, Jessica? Be specific. What exactly did you do that you now regret?" She glanced at Michael, who had stopped pacing and was standing with his back to both of us, staring out my front window. When he didn't offer any guidance, she looked back at me with the expression of someone who'd been caught in a lie and wasn't quite sure how to get out of it. "We may have exaggerated some things," Jessica said slowly, "made them sound more serious than they were. Such as? The thing with the stove. You weren't really in danger, but we thought if people knew you'd had a small incident, They'd understand why we were concerned about you living alone. I felt something cold and sharp settle in my chest. So you took a minor cooking mishap and turned it into evidence of dangerous confusion. We were trying to build a case for why you need more support, Jessica said, her voice gaining strength as if she were convincing herself. People our age, sometimes they don't want to admit when they need help. We thought if we could show a pattern. You thought if you could manufacture a pattern, I corrected. There was no real pattern, so you created one. Michael turned around from the window. Mom, you're 71 years old. You live in a big house by yourself. What happens if you fall down the stairs? What happens if you have a medical emergency and no one finds you for days? We're trying to be responsible here. I stood up from my chair, drawing myself to my full height. Michael James Morrison. I have been responsible for myself and others for 71 years. I raised 2 children, maintained a household, worked as a high school principal for 32 years, and cared for your father through 5 years of declining health. I have never in my life needed someone else to fabricate reasons why I should give up my independence. The use of his full name, the same tone I'd used when he was in serious trouble as a child, seemed to shake something loose in him. His shoulders sagged slightly, and for a moment he looked less like a calculating adult and more like the boy who used to come to me with scraped knees and broken toys. I know you're capable, Mom. I know you're still sharp and independent. But I also know that Dad's death hit you harder than you want to admit, and I worry about you being alone in this big house with all these memories. There it was. Finally, something that sounded like truth. So you decided to make the decision for me, I said quietly. Instead of talking to me about your concerns, instead of asking how I was really doing, you decided to undermine my reputation in the community, so that when you suggested assisted living, it would seem like the obviously sensible choice. Michael sat back down heavily, putting his head in his hands. It seemed like the kindest way. If you thought it was your idea, or if you felt like you didn't have a choice, it would be easier for everyone. Easier for who, exactly? He looked up at me with exhausted eyes. For all of us. You wouldn't have to feel like we were forcing you. We wouldn't have to be the bad guys pushing you out of your home. And you'd be safe and cared for. I walked to the window where he'd been standing and looked out at the street where I'd lived for 43 years. Mrs. Patterson's porch light was on, and I could see her cat sitting in the window. The Hendersons across the street had their television glowing blue in their living room. Normal people living normal lives, probably never suspecting that their neighbors were capable of this kind of deception. Michael, I said without turning around, do you have any idea how humiliating it is to discover that your own child thinks so little of your judgment that he'd rather lie to an entire community than have an honest conversation with you? I heard his chair scrape against the floor, but I didn't turn around. I had coffee with Eleanor Patterson yesterday. I continued. She complimented my garden and my organizational skills. She has no idea that other people in the neighborhood have been told I can't remember what day it is. Do you understand what that kind of rumor does to a person's reputation? Do you understand how hard it would be to rebuild trust once people believe you're mentally incompetent? Mom, we never wanted to hurt you. Now I did turn around. But you did hurt me. You've damaged my relationships with people I've known for decades. You've made me question my own perceptions and abilities. You've forced me to spend time and money proving my mental competence to medical professionals. I walked back to the table and picked up the medical report. Do you have any idea how frightening it was to think, even for a moment, that maybe you were right? That maybe I was losing my mind and didn't know it? Jessica was crying now, quiet tears that she kept wiping away with her napkin. Michael looked stricken, but I wasn't finished yet. And then there's the question of what you plan to do with the proceeds from selling my house. Both of them went very still. $400,000 you estimated. Probably more. Where exactly did you think that money should go? Michael's mouth opened and closed without any sound coming out. Jessica had stopped crying and was staring at me with something that looked like fear. Because I've been doing some research of my own this week, I continued. I called the assisted living facility you mentioned. The one you said was so nice, with individual apartments and meal service. Do you know what a one-bedroom unit there costs per month? They didn't answer. $4,000, I said. $4,000 a month for a basic apartment with meals. No medical care included. No assistance with activities of daily living, just housing and food. At that rate, my house proceeds would last less than 10 years. I sat back down and opened my purse, pulling out a manila folder I'd prepared. So I did a little more research. I looked into your financial situation, Michael. It's remarkable what you can learn from public records if you know where to look. Michael had gone pale. Mom, you had no right. I had every right to investigate someone who was spreading false information about my mental health and discussing the sale of my property. I opened the folder. Your mortgage is 3 months behind. You have 2 credit cards in collections. Jessica's car was repossessed last month, though I notice she's driving something new now. Jessica's tears had stopped entirely. She was looking at Michael with an expression I couldn't quite read. The business you told me was doing so well? The consulting firm. According to the state records, it was dissolved 6 months ago for failure to file required paperwork. I pulled out another document, and this is interesting. You applied for a home equity loan last month. The application was denied due to insufficient income and existing debt obligations. The silence in my dining room had a different quality now. Not the awkward pause of people caught in small lies, but the heavy quiet that comes when major deceptions are finally exposed. So let me see if I understand this correctly, I said. You're in serious financial trouble. You need a significant amount of money quickly. You know that I own this house outright, and you've calculated its approximate value. The only obstacle to accessing that money is that I'm perfectly capable of living independently and have no intention of selling. Michael started to speak, but I held up my hand. So you created a fictional medical condition that would justify forcing me out of my home. You spread rumors in the community to build credibility for your story. You recruited your wife to help establish a pattern of concerning incidents. And then you planned to present assisted living as the only safe option, knowing that the sale of this house would provide more than enough money to pay for my care while leaving a substantial amount left over. I closed the folder and looked at both of them. The question is, what exactly did you plan to do with that leftover money? Michael's face had gone from pale to red. It's not like that, Mom. We weren't trying to steal from you. Then explain to me what it is like. We hoped. He stopped and started again. You don't need a house this size. The maintenance costs, the property taxes, the utilities. It's wasteful for one person to live in a 4-bedroom house. If you were in assisted living, your expenses would be predictable, budgeted. The remaining money could be invested, managed properly. Managed by whom? Another silence. Michael, answer the question. If I sold this house and moved to assisted living, who exactly did you think should manage the remaining $300,000 or so? Jessica finally spoke up. We thought we could help. Set up some kind of trust or investment account. Make sure your money was working for you, instead of just sitting in savings accounts earning almost nothing. I almost laughed. Jessica, your car was repossessed last month, and you want me to trust you with my life savings? That was different, Michael said quickly. That was because my business had some temporary cash flow problems. It doesn't mean we don't know how to manage money properly. Actually, it means exactly that, I replied. People who know how to manage money don't lose their cars to repossession. They don't fall 3 months behind on their mortgage payments. They don't have multiple accounts and collections. I stood up and walked to my kitchen, needing a moment to process what I'd learned. Through the window, I could see their house next door, where they'd presumably been planning this deception for months. The house they might lose if they couldn't find a way to catch up on their mortgage payments. When I returned to the dining room, they were talking to each other in urgent whispers. They stopped when they saw me. Here's what's going to happen, I said, settling back into my chair. First, you're going to contact everyone you've spoken to about my supposed dementia. Everyone. You're going to tell them that you were mistaken, that I'm in perfect health, and that you apologize for any concern or confusion you may have caused. Michael started to protest, but I cut him off. Second, you're going to stop discussing my house, my finances, or my living arrangements with anyone. If people ask about my welfare, you're going to tell them I'm doing wonderfully and that you're proud of how well I'm managing on my own. Mom. Third, you're going to figure out your own financial problems without involving me or my assets. I'm willing to help you create a realistic budget and connect you with credit counseling services, but I am not going to fund your lifestyle or bail you out of debts you created. Jessica was crying again, but these tears looked different. Less self-pity, more genuine remorse. And finally, I continued, you're both going to think very carefully about whether you want to have an honest relationship with me going forward, or whether you prefer to continue seeing me as someone whose judgment can't be trusted, and whose assets are available for your use. I picked up the medical report and tapped it against the table, because I want you to understand something very clearly. Dr. Hendricks didn't just test my memory and reasoning abilities. She also evaluated my capacity to make decisions about my own welfare. According to her professional assessment, I am fully capable of managing my finances, my healthcare decisions, and my living arrangements. That means that any attempt to override my choices or manipulate my circumstances could be considered elder abuse. The words hung in the air like a threat, though I delivered them in the same calm tone I'd used to discuss property values and test scores. Michael's face had gone through several color changes during my speech, finally settling on a grayish pale that made him look older than his 37 years. Mom, you can't be serious. We're family. We would never abuse you. Michael, you've spent months spreading false stories about my mental health in order to manipulate me into selling my home and giving you access to the proceeds. What would you call that? He opened his mouth, then closed it without speaking. I know you're in financial trouble, I said, my voice softening slightly. I know you're scared and desperate and looking for solutions. But what you've done to me, to our relationship, to my reputation in this community, that's not something I can just forgive and forget. Jessica spoke up for the first time in several minutes. Helen, what can we do? How can we make this right? I looked at her, this woman who'd married my son 8 years ago and who I'd welcomed into my family without reservation. You can start by telling me the truth. All of it. How long have you been planning this? How many people have you talked to? What exactly did you tell them? She glanced at Michael, who nodded reluctantly. It started about 4 months ago, Jessica said quietly. Michael lost his biggest client, and we realized we were going to lose the house if something didn't change quickly. We talked about asking you for help, but Michael thought you'd say no. Did you actually ask me? No, Michael admitted. But Mom, you've always been so independent, so proud of managing everything yourself. I didn't think you'd want to get involved in our financial problems. So instead of giving me the chance to help my son voluntarily, you decided to manipulate me into it. It wasn't supposed to be manipulation, Jessica said. We genuinely thought you'd be happier in assisted living. Safer, with more social interaction. And if selling the house helped us too, well, that seemed like everyone winning. I studied both their faces, looking for signs of deception or continued manipulation. What I saw instead was exhaustion, shame, and what looked like genuine regret. How many people did you talk to? I asked. Not that many, Jessica said quickly, then corrected herself under my steady gaze. Maybe a dozen neighbors. My sister in Portland. A few people from church. Linda? Yes, Michael said. I called Linda about 2 months ago. I was hoping she might talk to you about moving somewhere with more support, but she said you seemed fine when she talked to you. So you convinced her I was hiding my problems from her too. I told her that people with early dementia often don't recognize their own symptoms, Michael said miserably. I said the family needed to make decisions for your own safety. The betrayal felt fresh all over again. Not just Michael and Jessica, but my own daughter, 3,000 miles away, believing that I was losing my mind. This ends now, I said firmly. Tonight. You're going to start making phone calls. And you're going to continue making them until everyone who heard these stories hears the truth. I don't care how embarrassing it is for you. I don't care how it makes you look. You created this situation, and you're going to fix it. And if we do that, Michael asked, if we make all the calls and apologize to everyone, what happens then? I was quiet for a long moment, thinking about the question underneath his question. What happens to our relationship? What happens to the trust that's been broken? What happens to the love between a mother and son when that love has been used as a weapon? Then we see if it's possible to rebuild something authentic between us, I said finally. But Michael, I want you to understand that things are never going to be the same. I'm never again going to assume that you have my best interests at heart. I'm never again going to take your word for things without verification, and I'm never, ever going to give you access to my financial information or decision-making without legal documentation. His face crumpled slightly. Mom, I love you. I know I screwed this up, but I do love you. I love you too, I said, and meant it. But love isn't enough anymore. Trust has to be earned back, and that's going to take time. A lot of time. Jessica cleared her throat. Helen, what about our financial situation? The mortgage, the debts, we really are in trouble. I looked at her steadily. Jessica, I'm going to say this once, and I want you to hear me clearly. Your financial problems are not my responsibility. You're both adults who made choices that led to this situation. The solution is not to manipulate me into funding your recovery. But we're family, Michael said. Family doesn't lie to each other about medical conditions. Family doesn't spread rumors to undermine each other's reputations. Family doesn't plot to steal each other's homes. I stood up from the table. You want to be my family? Then start acting like it. I walked them to the front door, where we stood for an awkward moment. Jessica hugged me briefly, whispering, I'm sorry, against my shoulder. Michael hesitated, then kissed my cheek the same way he'd done for 37 years. Mom, he said quietly, I really am sorry. We never meant for it to go this far. Michael, I replied, the problem isn't how far it went. The problem is that it went anywhere at all. After they left, I sat in my living room with a cup of tea and thought about the evening. The confrontation had gone better than I'd expected in some ways, worse in others. They'd admitted to their deception, which was more than I'd dared hope for. But the casual way they'd discussed my finances and living arrangements, as if I were a child whose preferences were irrelevant, had been more hurtful than I'd anticipated. The next morning, I called Dr. Hendricks' office and asked for additional copies of my cognitive evaluation. I wanted to send one to Linda in Seattle and keep several for my own records. If this situation had taught me anything, it was that documentation was everything. I also called my attorney, a woman named Patricia Wells, who'd handled my will and estate planning after Robert died. I explained the situation and asked about legal protections against future manipulation. Helen, Patricia said after I'd finished my story, what your son did could potentially be considered elder abuse, even though no money actually changed hands. Spreading false information about someone's mental capacity in order to gain control of their assets is a serious matter. I don't want to press charges, I said quickly. I just want to make sure it can't happen again. I understand. Let me suggest a few things. First, we should update your power of attorney documents to include very specific language about mental capacity evaluations. Second, we should consider setting up a revocable trust with an independent trustee for your major assets. And third, I think you should consider documenting this incident thoroughly, just in case there are future attempts at manipulation. By the end of the week, I'd received phone calls from several neighbors who'd heard from Michael and Jessica about their mistake in thinking I had dementia. Mrs. Patterson was particularly indignant on my behalf. Helen, dear, she said when she called, I cannot believe anyone would think you were confused about anything. You're sharper than people half your age. I told Jessica she must have been talking about someone else entirely. Linda called from Seattle, apologetic and embarrassed. Mom, I'm so sorry I believed those stories. When I think about how I talked to you, treating you like you couldn't understand your own situation, I feel terrible. Linda, I said, you believed someone you trusted. That's not your fault. But I hope this teaches both of us to be more careful about accepting secondhand information, even from family. Have you forgiven them, Michael and Jessica? I thought about the question. I'm working on it. Forgiveness and trust are different things, though. I can forgive them for being desperate and making poor choices, but trusting them with my well-being again, that's going to take much longer. 3 weeks later, Michael came by alone on a Thursday evening. He looked thinner, more tired, but somehow more honest than he had in months. Mom, he said when I let him in, I wanted to update you on the calls we made, and to talk to you about something else. We sat in the living room this time, a less formal setting than the dining room confrontation. We contacted everyone we could remember talking to, he said. Explained that we'd been wrong about your health, that you'd been evaluated by doctors, and were completely fine. Most people were understanding. Some were pretty angry with us. I imagine so. And Jessica and I have been talking to a credit counselor, like you suggested. We're working on a plan to deal with our debts without losing the house. He paused. It's going to be tight for a couple of years, but it's doable if we're careful. That's good to hear. Mom, I also wanted to ask, would you be willing to have dinner with us sometime? I know things are different now, and I know you don't trust us the same way. But I'd like to try to rebuild something, if you're willing. I looked at my son, this man I'd raised and loved, and who had hurt me more deeply than I'd thought possible. Michael, I'm willing to try. But I meant what I said before. Things are different now. I'm different now. I know, and I understand why. He was quiet for a moment. Mom, can I ask you something? When you figured out what we were doing, how did you feel? Really feel? It was a fair question, and it deserved an honest answer. Terrified, I said. For about 12 hours I was genuinely terrified that maybe you were right, maybe I was losing my mind, and didn't know it. That's why I scheduled the cognitive evaluation so quickly. I had to know for sure. I never thought about that, about how scary it would be for you. And then, when I knew my mind was fine, I felt betrayed. By you, by Jessica, even by Linda for believing the stories so easily. I felt like the people I trusted most in the world had decided I was incompetent without ever asking me how I felt or what I wanted. Michael's eyes were bright with unshed tears. Mom, I am so sorry. Not just for what we did, but for how we made you feel. You've never been anything but capable and strong, and we treated you like a child who couldn't make her own decisions. Yes, you did. How do I fix that? How do we fix that? I thought about it carefully. Time, mostly. Consistency. Treating me like an intelligent adult whose opinions matter. And Michael, if you're ever in serious trouble again, talk to me honestly, instead of trying to manipulate me into helping. I might surprise you. You mean you would have helped us with the mortgage? I might have. Or I might have helped you find other solutions. But I would have treated it as a conversation between equals, not a scheme to trick me into giving up my independence. We talked for another hour, carefully and honestly in a way we hadn't done in years. When he left, I felt cautiously hopeful that we might eventually find our way back to a relationship based on mutual respect, rather than manipulation and lies. That night, I sat in my garden as the sun set, surrounded by the flowers I'd planted and tended for decades. The house behind me was quiet and familiar, filled with 43 years of memories. Tomorrow, I would wake up in my own bed, make coffee in my own kitchen, and decide for myself how to spend my day. It occurred to me that Michael had been right about one thing. I was getting older, and someday I might need more help than I currently required. But when that day came, it would be my decision to make, based on my own assessment of my needs and capabilities, not someone else's fictional story about my mental decline. I pulled out my phone and scrolled to Dr. Hendricks' number. Tomorrow, I would call and ask about setting up annual cognitive evaluations, not because I doubted my abilities, but because I wanted ongoing documentation of my competence. If anyone ever again tried to question my mental capacity, I would have medical evidence to support my position. Some lessons, I reflected, are harder than others. But this one had taught me something valuable about the difference between being loved and being respected, between being cared for and being controlled. At 71, I was apparently still learning new things about people, including my own family. The evening air was cool on my face, and I could smell the last roses of the season blooming near my back fence. In Mrs. Patterson's yard, I could see her moving around in her kitchen, probably preparing her evening tea. Normal life, continuing on despite the drama that had consumed my world for the past few weeks. I stayed in the garden until the stars came out, thinking about trust and forgiveness, about independence and family, about the stories we tell about each other, and the power those stories have to shape reality. Tomorrow, I would call Linda and plan a visit to Seattle. I would schedule lunch with Margaret and thank her for her support. I would continue living my life exactly as I chose to, in my own house, on my own terms. Some victories, I was learning, taste like freedom. The morning after my conversation with Michael, I woke with a sense of purpose I hadn't felt in months. The autumn sunlight streamed through my bedroom curtains, illuminating the familiar patterns of the wallpaper Robert and I had chosen together 15 years ago. For the first time since this ordeal began, I felt completely at home in my own space again. I made coffee and sat at my kitchen table with a legal pad, making lists the way I'd done when I was principal of Roosevelt High School, and faced with complex problems that required systematic solutions. The first list was practical: people to call, documents to organize, safeguards to put in place. The second list was more personal: relationships to repair, boundaries to establish, trust to rebuild where possible. Margaret called just as I was finishing my second cup of coffee. "Ruth called me last night?" she said without preamble. Margaret's network of retired professionals was more efficient than any gossip chain I'd ever encountered. She heard about Michael and Jessica's apology tour from her neighbor. "How are you holding up?" "Better than expected," I said honestly. There's something liberating about having everything out in the open, even when it's ugly. I walked to the window and looked out at my garden, where the morning dew was still sparkling on the spider webs stretched between my rose bushes. "Margaret, can I ask you something? In your years at the bank, how often did you see families torn apart by financial desperation?" There was a pause while she considered the question. "More often than you'd think. Money makes people do things they never imagined they were capable of. The scary part is how they justify it to themselves. They convince themselves they're helping, or that they deserve it, or that the other person won't mind if they never find out. Do you think Michael really believed I'd be happier in assisted living?" "Maybe partly. But Helen, people believe what they need to believe to live with their choices. If moving you to assisted living solved his financial problems and gave him access to your house proceeds, then of course he'd convince himself it was for your own good." After Margaret hung up, I called Patricia Wells, my attorney. She had good news about the legal protections we'd discussed. "I've drafted new power of attorney documents that require 2 independent medical evaluations before anyone can make decisions about your care or housing," Patricia said. "I've also prepared paperwork for a revocable trust that would put your house and major assets under independent management if you ever become incapacitated. The trustee would be the bank, not a family member. How does Michael feel about that?" "He doesn't need to feel anything about it. These are your assets, Helen. You have every right to protect them as you see fit." Patricia's voice was crisp and professional, but I could hear the underlying warmth. "I will say, though, that most families work these things out without needing legal intervention. The fact that you feel you need these protections tells me the trust damage is more serious than you might be willing to admit." She was right, of course. If I truly trusted Michael to have my best interests at heart, I wouldn't need legal documents to protect myself from his decisions. The knowledge sat heavy in my chest, a grief I wasn't quite ready to fully acknowledge. That afternoon, Linda called from Seattle. "Mom, I've been thinking about what happened, and I have a confession to make." Her voice was tight with what sounded like guilt. When Michael first called me about his concerns, I was actually relieved. "Relieved? I've been worried about you since Dad died. Not because you seemed confused or incapable, but because you seemed so determined to prove you could handle everything alone. When Michael said you might need more help, part of me thought it would be good for you to accept support." I sat down heavily in my living room chair. "Linda, there's a difference between accepting help and being declared incompetent. I know that now. But Mom, you have to understand, from 3,000 miles away, it's hard to know what's really going on. When your brother calls and says you're having memory problems, and he gives specific examples, what am I supposed to think? You're supposed to call me and ask how I'm doing." The silence on the other end lasted long enough that I wondered if we'd been disconnected. Finally, Linda spoke. "You're right. I should have called you directly. I should have trusted my own judgment instead of taking Michael's word for it." She paused. "Mom, I want to come visit. Soon. Not because I think you need checking up on, but because I want to see for myself how you're really doing. And because I miss you. I'd like that very much. And Mom, I'm proud of how you handled this whole thing. The way you got the medical evaluation, gathered evidence, confronted them with facts instead of just emotions. That took real courage. After Linda hung up, I realized I was crying. Not from sadness, exactly, but from relief. My daughter still saw me as competent, still respected my judgment. The relationship with Michael might be permanently changed, but Linda and I could rebuild on a foundation of mutual respect. The doorbell rang just before dinner. Through the peephole, I could see Jessica standing on my front porch, holding what looked like a casserole dish. She was alone, which surprised me. Since their wedding 8 years ago, Jessica and Michael had been nearly inseparable in their social interactions. "Helen," she said when I opened the door, "I hope it's all right that I stopped by. I made too much lasagna, and I thought you might like some." The offering felt symbolic, though I wasn't sure of what. Peace? Apology? An attempt to return to some version of normal? "Come in," I said, stepping aside. "Though I have to say, this is unexpected." She followed me to the kitchen, where I took the casserole dish and set it on the counter. "It smells wonderful." "Thank you. Helen, I wanted to talk to you without Michael here. About what happened, and about where we go from here." Jessica sat at my kitchen table without being invited, a familiarity that felt both presumptuous and strangely comforting. "All right. I know you probably think I'm just as guilty as Michael in all this, and you're not wrong. But I want you to know that the idea of claiming you had dementia, that was his idea. I went along with it, which makes me complicit, but I didn't initiate it." I poured 2 glasses of iced tea and sat across from her. "Why are you telling me this?" "Because I don't want you to think I'm the kind of person who would come up with that kind of plan on my own. I'm not proud of going along with it, but I wasn't the mastermind." Jessica's hands were wrapped around her tea glass, and I noticed she wasn't wearing her wedding ring. "Jessica, are you and Michael having problems beyond the financial ones?" She looked up at me with eyes that were bright with unshed tears. "Helen, my husband spent 4 months lying to everyone about his mother's mental health in order to steal her house. What kind of man does that?" She wiped her eyes with the back of her hand. "And what kind of woman goes along with it?" The question hung between us like something fragile and sharp. I realized that Jessica was struggling with the same issues I was. How do you continue loving someone who's capable of that level of deception? How do you trust your judgment about a person when they've shown you a side of themselves you never suspected existed? "People do desperate things when they're scared," I said carefully. "That's what I keep telling myself. That we were desperate. That we weren't thinking clearly. That we would never normally even consider something like this." Jessica looked around my kitchen, taking in the familiar details. The herbs growing on the windowsill, the photos on the refrigerator, the evidence of a life fully and competently lived. "But Helen, I can't stop thinking about how easily it came to him. The lies, the manipulation, the way he talked about you like you were a problem to be solved instead of a person with feelings and rights. Have you told him how you feel?" "We've been fighting about it for weeks. He keeps saying it wasn't that bad, that no real harm was done, that you're fine, so what's the problem?" Jessica's voice was getting higher, more strained. "He doesn't understand that the harm was in the attempt. The harm was in thinking it was acceptable to lie about your mental health. The harm was in treating you like your opinions and preferences didn't matter." I found myself in the strange position of potentially comforting my daughter-in-law about my son's character flaws. "Jessica, marriage is complicated. People make mistakes, even serious ones. The question is whether Michael understands what he did wrong and whether he's capable of changing. I don't think he does understand. He keeps talking about it like it was a business decision that didn't work out, not like it was a betrayal of someone he claims to love." She looked at me directly. "Helen, I'm thinking about leaving him." The words hit me like a physical blow. Not because I disagreed with her reasoning, but because I realized that Michael's actions might cost him his marriage as well as his relationship with me. The consequences were spreading outward like ripples from a stone thrown in still water. Have you considered counseling? I suggested it. He said we don't need counseling, we need money. He still doesn't get it. Jessica finished her tea and stood up. I should go. I just wanted you to know that I'm sorry, and that I don't expect you to forgive me, but I needed you to understand that I know what we did was wrong. After she left, I sat in my kitchen thinking about marriage, about the promises people make to each other, and how those promises can be tested by circumstances no one anticipates. Robert and I had never faced the kind of financial pressure that Michael and Jessica were dealing with, but we'd had our own challenges. Illness, job losses, disagreements about money and children and priorities. We'd survived because we'd faced those challenges together, honestly, without trying to manipulate each other or outside parties to get what we wanted. I thought about calling Michael, then decided against it. If his marriage was in trouble, he needed to work that out with Jessica, not involve me in their conflicts. I'd had enough of being manipulated by family members, even well-intentioned manipulation. The next few weeks settled into a new routine. I went to my book club meetings, tended my garden, had coffee with Margaret, and lived my life exactly as I had before this whole ordeal began. The difference was internal. I felt more alert to other people's motivations, more careful about what information I shared, more protective of my independence. Michael called twice during that period, both brief conversations about practical matters. He needed to borrow my hedge trimmer. He wanted to know if I was still planning to host Thanksgiving dinner. Normal interactions that felt oddly stilted, as if we were both being very careful not to say anything that might trigger another confrontation. The third call was different. "Mom," he said without preamble, "Jessica moved out last week." His voice was flat, exhausted. She's staying with her sister while she decides what she wants to do. I set down the book I'd been reading and gave him my full attention. "I'm sorry to hear that, Michael. How are you doing?" "Not great. The house feels empty and I'm realizing I might lose everything. The mortgage, the marriage, my relationship with you." He was quiet for a moment. "Mom, I think I need help. Real help, not financial help. I think I need to talk to someone about why I thought what we did was acceptable." It was the first time since this began that he'd sounded like the son I remembered, vulnerable and honest instead of calculating and defensive. "I think that's a good idea," I said carefully. "Do you want help finding someone to talk to?" "Would you? I don't even know where to start." I spent the next hour on the phone with Michael, helping him research therapists who specialized in family relationships and financial stress. It felt like the first constructive conversation we'd had in months, maybe years. Not because we were pretending nothing had happened, but because we were finally addressing it honestly. A month later, Michael appeared at my door on a Saturday afternoon. He looked different somehow, thinner but more solid, if that made sense. Less frantic, more grounded. "Mom, I wanted to update you on some things, and to ask you something." We sat in my living room, where afternoon light was filtering through the lace curtains my mother had made decades ago. The setting felt appropriately formal for what I sensed was going to be an important conversation. "I've been seeing Dr. Martinez, the therapist you helped me find. We've been talking about what happened, about why I thought it was acceptable to lie about your health." Michael looked directly at me when he spoke, something he'd had trouble doing in our previous conversations. "She helped me understand that I wasn't really trying to help you. I was trying to solve my own problems and using you to do it." That must have been difficult to recognize. It was. But Mom, I also realized something else. I've been treating you like you were fragile and incompetent for years, not just during this whole dementia thing. Every time I offered to handle something for you, every time I suggested you might be taking on too much, every time I talked about you to other people like you needed protection. He paused. "I think I started seeing you as helpless when Dad died, and I never updated that perception even when you proved over and over that you were managing fine on your own." I thought about this observation. It was true that Michael had become more hovering, more protective after Robert's death. I'd attributed it to grief and concern, but perhaps it had been something more problematic. "Why do you think you did that?" Dr. Martinez thinks it made me feel important, needed, like I was being a good son by looking out for you. But really, I was diminishing your capabilities so I could feel better about myself. Michael shifted in his chair, clearly uncomfortable with what he was admitting. And when we got in financial trouble, that pattern made it easier to justify using you to solve our problems. If you were already helpless and dependent, then making decisions for you wasn't that big a leap. The insight was painful but rang true. I remembered numerous instances over the past 5 years when Michael had swooped in to help with things I was handling perfectly well on my own. At the time, I'd been touched by his attentiveness. Now I wondered if I'd been enabling a dynamic that had ultimately led to this crisis. What about Jessica? Is she coming back? I don't know, we're talking, but she says she needs to see evidence that I've really changed, not just in how I treat her, but in how I think about relationships in general. She says watching what I did to you made her realize she didn't know who she'd married. The sadness in his voice was genuine, and I felt a familiar maternal urge to comfort him. But I also remembered Patricia Wells' advice about the difference between supporting someone and enabling them. Michael, what evidence would convince her that you've changed? I don't know yet. Dr. Martinez says I need to focus on actually changing, not on managing other people's perceptions of my changes. He looked around my living room, taking in the photos and mementos of a life lived fully and independently. Mom, I have something to ask you, and I want you to know that it's okay to say no. I waited. I want to try to rebuild our relationship, but I want to do it differently this time. I want to treat you like the competent, intelligent adult you are, not like someone who needs my protection or management. Michael leaned forward slightly. Would you be willing to have dinner with me once a week? Not at my house, not at your house, but somewhere neutral, where we can just talk to each other as equals. The request surprised me with its thoughtfulness. What would we talk about? I don't know. Your life, my life, books you're reading, places you want to travel, projects I'm working on. Normal things that people who respect each other talk about. He smiled for the first time since he'd arrived. I realized I don't actually know very much about what you think or want or care about, because I've been too busy assuming you needed me to think for you. I considered the proposal. The idea of rebuilding our relationship on more equal footing was appealing, but I was also aware that trust, once broken, doesn't repair quickly or easily. I'm willing to try, I said finally. But Michael, I meant what I said before. Things are different now. I'm not going to pretend this didn't happen, and I'm not going to go back to letting you treat me like I'm incompetent. I understand. And Mom, I don't want to go back to that either. I want to know who you really are when you're not being managed or protected or worried about. I think I might actually like that person better than the version I created in my head. We had dinner the following Thursday at a quiet restaurant downtown. Michael asked me about my book club, my garden plans for next spring, and my thoughts about a documentary I'd mentioned watching. He told me about his job search, his therapy sessions, and a cooking class he was considering taking. It wasn't the easy, familiar conversation we'd once shared, but it was honest and respectful in a way our interactions hadn't been in years. As I drove home that night, I reflected on how strange it was to be getting to know my own son, as if he were someone I'd just met. But perhaps that was what we both needed. A chance to meet each other as we really were, rather than as the people we'd assumed each other to be. The legal documents Patricia had prepared were signed and filed. My house was protected, my medical decisions were protected, and my financial assets were protected. But more importantly, I'd learned to protect myself through awareness, documentation, and the willingness to confront uncomfortable truths. 3 months after that first dinner, Linda visited from Seattle. She spent a week with me, and I watched her observe my daily routines with the eye of someone looking for signs of decline or confusion. What she found instead was a 71-year-old woman living independently, competently, and contentedly in her own home. Mom, she said on her last evening, I owe you an apology. Not just for believing Michael's stories, but for not staying in better touch with your actual life. If I'd been calling regularly, if I'd known what your days were really like, I would have known immediately that his claims didn't make sense. Linda, you live 3,000 miles away. You can't monitor my daily life from Seattle. No, but I could have maintained a real relationship with you instead of just checking in when I felt guilty about not calling. She looked around my living room where we'd been sorting through old photo albums together. I want to do better. Not because I'm worried about you, but because I miss knowing what's going on in your life." The evening before Linda left, Michael joined us for dinner at my house. It was the first time the three of us had been together since the confrontation, and I wasn't sure how it would go. But the conversation was easier than I'd expected, partly because Linda's presence seemed to help Michael remember how to interact with me as a person, rather than as a problem to be managed. "Mom," Linda said as we were clearing dishes, "I have something to tell you both. I'm thinking about moving back to the East Coast." "Not to keep an eye on Mom," she added quickly, seeing Michael's expression, "but because I miss being part of a family that sees each other more than once a year." The idea of having Linda closer was wonderful, but I also recognized the complexity of what she was suggesting. "Linda, that's a big decision. Are you sure it's not just a reaction to what happened with Michael?" "Partly it is. This whole situation made me realize how disconnected I've become from both of you. But it's also been something I've been considering for a while. My company has an office in Philadelphia. I could transfer there and be 4 hours away instead of across the country." Michael was quiet during this exchange, but I could see him processing the implications. If Linda moved closer, he would no longer be my only nearby family member. The responsibility and the potential for control would be shared. "How do you feel about that?" I asked him directly. "Honestly, relieved. I think one of the problems with our situation was that I felt like I was the only one watching out for you. If Linda was closer, there would be less pressure on me to make sure you're okay." He paused. "And maybe less temptation to override your decisions if I disagree with them." It was a remarkably honest and self-aware response. 6 months ago, I would have been touched by his sense of responsibility. Now I was impressed by his recognition that the responsibility had been problematic. As I walked Linda to her rental car the next morning, she hugged me tightly. "Mom, I'm proud of how you handled all this. You proved that you're not just capable, you're formidable." After she drove away, I stood in my driveway looking at the house I'd fought to keep, the garden I'd maintained for decades, the life I'd built and defended. The morning air was crisp with the promise of winter, and I could see my breath in small puffs as I breathed. I felt more myself than I had in months, more confident in my own judgment, more aware of my own strength. Some battles, I realized, you don't know you're capable of fighting until you have no choice but to fight them. This one had cost me my naive trust in my own family, but it had given me something more valuable: absolute certainty in my own competence and worth. I went back inside to make coffee and plan my day, the same as I had every morning for years. The difference was that now I knew, beyond any doubt, that these were my days to plan, my decisions to make, my life to live. And no one, not even people who claimed to love me, had the right to take that away. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.